some of my most dear friends all joining. It's fantastic. It's like having a social get together.
Okay, they're still coming pretty regularly, so let's wait a little longer.
Ivor, did you see Fred's comment in the chat? Tremendous admiration for your statement broadcast on CBS Local.
Fred, I appreciate that. My response will be brief in that regard tonight, and just say that I hope that you will help me focus on talking about doing right by our community and our employees, and that's hopefully what we can spend a little time on this evening. But thank you for your comment. It means a lot.
Thanks. So good to see everyone.
Yeah. It's literally like Shabbos, like, you know, subdivision. It's lovely.
I'm going to join from another channel without camera and sign off on this one shortly.
See you, Fred.
Oh, meeting pass. Oh, yes.
Fred, you gardening?
Yes.
Good
Not
for
as
you.
much. Not as much as I'd like. Just too hot. Okay, I'm coming off this one. I'll still have audio.
I am still here, but I'll mute.
Right.
All right, great to see everyone. Thanks for coming. This is going to be a very interesting presentation. I've been looking forward to this for several weeks now. I'm Rabbi Dahlin, for those of you who don't know me, the rabbi of the Hebrew, one of the rabbis of the Hebrew Educational Alliance. Rabbi Grunwald is also on the call. He is my partner, rabbinic partner over at the Alliance. It's good to have him. Members of my family who are on, and friends, all, we want to welcome you. So in Judaism, God creates the world every day and every moment. God is always in action of creation of the world, sustains it really every moment. But we learn in our tradition that we are partners with God. So we, in a sense, are partners in creating this world and making this world better, and making ourselves and others better, to live in this world that God co-creates with us. So it's not all up to God. We have a part to play in sustaining this world. And when I think of what's going on today with the coronavirus and all that we are dealing with today, I think of our front line, the people on the front line that are in a real sense risking their lives to care for others. I think of the physicians in our congregation, around the community, and everyone else in the medical field that are on the front lines doing incredibly important work, healing and really saving people's lives. So I thought it would be a great evening program to have one of the physicians that are truly working on the front lines, perhaps even more so than any other physician. And that is a member of our congregation, a good friend of all of us, Ivor Douglas. I just want to say something very briefly about Ivor. His bio is very lengthy. He has awards. He has an amazing educational and training background. And he truly is right there where people are in the greatest need. So Dr. Douglas is chief of the Division of Pulmonary Sciences and Critical Medicine at Denver Health Medical Center and director of the Medical Intensive Care Unit. He is an associate professor of medicine at the University of Colorado, Denver. He is co-chair of the Medical Center's Critical Care Committee, which puts him right on the front lines. And thank you so much, Ira, for coming and participating, presenting tonight. Just a couple of questions, general questions, and I know that Dr. Douglas will be able to make a wonderful presentation to us about what's going on in the hospitals. But if you can, tell us a little bit about your day in the hospitals working with patients, particularly COVID patients, and maybe what it's like, what it has been like, and what's going on now. Are things getting better? Is the medical field and the hospitals more able to keep up with the disease now than they were in the past? And what's the direction? And perhaps tell us a little bit about what we should be thinking about regarding the next days and months with the openings that are happening. They're controversial in many states. Maybe give us some kind of sense of, from the medical point of view, what's going on in this country, and are we going in the right direction? So I'll give it over to you, and really look forward to what you have to say.
Rabbi Dolan, Rabbi Grunwald, and to our friends and community, it's really an honor and seriously unsolicited privilege, so thank you. I said just as some of you are coming on that so many on this line are friends, people I have Shabbos dinner with, have a little schnapps every now and again. I have my mom in South Africa, my cousin in Seattle. So really, this is like a unique opportunity. I think without COVID, in a strange way, this would never have happened. I'm going to speak for about 10 or 15 minutes, and I'm going to cover a lot of the topics that Rabbi Dolan has touched on. If I could take the liberty of suggesting everybody put themselves on mute, not because I don't want to hear back from you, but it prevents a little bit of feedback. And what I'm hoping to do is paint a picture of what perhaps a day in the life is, a little bit, really not to spend too much time on disease state. I think we're all very educated on where we are from a pandemic perspective, but I want to talk a little bit about the direct impacts of what's happening in people's lives, what's happening in our local front range community, what's the impact on how we provide health services. I want to talk a little bit about what it's been like to be part of a team. It's probably one of the major focus areas of tonight. And then I want to spend some time at the end of my comments to really focus down on models, prediction, and the future. And I'm blessed to have my cousin Ruth Etzioni, who's in Seattle, who's a world expert epidemiology modeler. She's hopefully make some additional comments during our discussion, and I'm delighted she could join us. You know, my days have been incredibly concentrated. And when people ask me what the sensation is like, I can honestly say it is a daily mix of sheer terror, like a real terrifying experience, and highly energized engagement. And I'll explain to you why that is. The terror is a little self-evident, but it's terror more about the unknown, which is an intensivist of almost 30 years is, and I say this with real humility, most days at the office are most days of the office. To say that the last 2.5 months have been without precedent, some of the most cognitively and clinically challenging of my career is true. I've literally just finished up 7 straight days and nights. The way my team is trying to do it is concentrate our on-call schedule so that we get a block of time on for a week, and then we actually step out of the clinical environment doing our admin and research for a week. Mainly that if we then have contracted COVID, we have a little bit of an incubation period so we can actually be screened and then get isolated if we get positive. And unfortunately, several of my staff have turned positive, not my physicians, but 2 of my really outstanding nurses. So this is real, this is tangible, and the terror is clearly both that for personal risk, but also a real burden that we're carrying a number of gravely ill patients from some of the most underserved and socioeconomically disabled or socioeconomically unprivileged in our community at Denver Health. And with a real recognition that this illness, more than almost any that we have seen, carries with it the burden of significant disparity when it comes to socioeconomic, ethnic, and racial disparity and the way that it has hit our inner city communities. It's also hit our aged. It's hitting our prison population. I'm going to talk to you about that in just a second. And so as we sit comfortably, I'm in my wife's nice office. I see several of you on your couches, enjoying your outside. Thank God we have these opportunities. But at every point, I think it's got to be appreciated that for the many, many people, the COVID epidemic is one where the terror factor is a real one. It's the fact that social distancing, both in our country and globally, is not an achievable objective. My mom's sitting in Durban, South Africa, where they've had a very serious, very restrictive shutdown of the economy, mainly because in very clustered environments, it's very difficult to separate. We have the privilege of being able to do that. So my day might be something along the lines of a very early start, perhaps a couple of calls overnight from my fellow, luckily not too many going-ins in the night. And really my first moments are after actually getting my head together and getting some caffeine is looking at where we are in terms of our environment. And a lot of my role as a director of critical care is situational awareness. It's more than just my patient in the bed. It's where are we as an institution? Where is my institution and the regional institution sitting in terms of things like ICU beds, ED beds, ventilators, critical medications, things I'm going to talk to you about in a minute that have nothing to do with management of COVID. And then as we have started to emerge from the peak of COVID, the appreciation that we have this sizable uptick of just regular sick people needing healthcare that has really strained our health system in the last 2 to 3 weeks. I usually get into the ICU around 7:30, spend a little time getting ready for rounds, and then we have a very long-standing tradition of running multidisciplinary care rounds in ICUs, so that our day historically has always been very physically proximate. We always start our day with our residents and fellow teams, our social workers, chaplains, physical and occupational therapy, nutrition, case managers, literally sitting in a room together and going through our patients and doing some prioritization. So the core operations of our day, which are so anchored on the team and prioritization and feeding off one another, has become somewhat disrupted by the fact that physical social distancing is a mandate. We then spend about 3 to 4 hours, depending on the number of patients, actually seeing patients bed to bed. And what has been very different from my usual care is because I'm an academic teaching physician as well as a researcher, is that my practice is I go up in the bed, I go in the ICU and I look at patients and examine them and teach at the bedside and talk to the nurses and therapists and the pharmacists. And now the entire process is outside a room with a patient inside a room. And to get into the room will take me another 5 minutes of garbing up into what's called personal protective equipment, face gear, etc. And then spending just a fraction of the time on my own with a patient when really my role is to lead a team. And so that's been a remarkably difficult thing to do. Along with that has been the transition in the way we care for patients. One of the remarkable opportunities I've had at Denver Health is to build family and patient-centered care models, where our families are literally part of the care team. And over 23 hours a day, we invite them to leave for just half an hour on shift change most days. The families are part of the care group. And for any of you who've ever been in, and I know Rabbi Baskin's come to visit a few times and others. It's so much part of the way we do business to have families on rounds and transact with us and participate in the care that it has become ghostly in a way and so remote to have virtually no family present ever. And I'm going to talk to you about the challenges and emotional strains at the end of these comments about how that has impacted the care, particularly for those at the end of life and for those for whom withholding and withdrawal of life-sustaining therapy is ongoing. So that's been very challenging. We then do a very interesting new multidisciplinary round where with our surgeons and our hospitalists and all the team, we actually go down to a big conference room where we can be physically distant, but still in the same place. And we have now coordinated what are called surge ICU teams. So I usually run 2 medical ICU teams. I'm running 5 medical ICU teams at the moment. And because I don't have enough people to do all of that, I have 3 of those run by my pulmonary critical care doctors, 1 run by a group of hospitalists, and then the 5th run by a brave group of cardiologists who decided that doing critical care was their new calling. And this collaboration with our surgeons has been just an innovation. So coupled with the terror has been this excitement it's not a morbid excitement, it's a real organizational challenge on how do we bring people that don't necessarily have training, expertise, but have tremendous commitment to caring for these patients into a space where we can get them trained up quickly, get them to the workplace in a supervised way, and actually participate in the care of these patients. And by doing this, we've cared for several hundred patients in our units. We still, unfortunately, have several in our ICU. But I'm going to share some unpublished data that we just are getting together for a manuscript, is that our mortality at Denver Health for our ICU COVID patients is 16%. 16%. For those who ended up on a ventilator, it's 25%. And if you're following any of the news around this, you'll appreciate that is half to a third of the mortality rate that's being published out of New York and New Jersey. Now, we're doing some amazing things, but somebody had asked me before this evening, can't you make this a little uplifting? With 100,000 dead in our country and many hundreds of thousands around the world, it's hard to be uplifting. This has been tragic in a way that I don't think as a society, as a people, as a community, as families, it's going to take us so long to even begin processing the magnitude of this in the most personal way. But the heartening thing is that when you work in organizations that can support this kind of flexibility and nimbleness and ability to bring expertise to the bedside, and most importantly, I have younger patients with fewer comorbidities, there are good things that can come out of it. And I am encouraged to say both at my center, the University of Colorado Hospital, St. Joseph's, Rose, Littleton, St. Anthony's, leaving many of my collaborators out, the data for Colorado outcomes for those who are hospitalized is grim, but certainly less grim than we have been hearing from the East Coast and certainly from Seattle and others. My day then usually wraps after the multidisciplinary meeting with a lot of bedside visits. So it's my practice still to see every single patient personally. And that's not been the practice of all of my colleagues. Some of my colleagues have found it very difficult to commit to go room to room to room, PPE and all from one patient to the other. And, I couldn't be more respectful. I guess I'm a bit of an old-fashioned doc that I really trust myself more than others, which is probably a weakness, but I really need to see my patients directly, and particularly the most gravely ill. The other part of my job is administration and research, and the rest of my day is usually split between those. And administration has been a huge part of getting this operational effort together, both at the hospital level, at a regional level, and I work nationally as well. You're certainly aware of the scramble to secure PPE, sufficient ventilators, and then to think about crisis standards of care. What would have happened if we'd gone over the top and run out of ventilators? What would have happened if we don't have enough PPE for the second surge that is inevitably coming, that we can talk about in a minute? And then the biggest challenge that I'm having every day is that common medications, things that I use to keep people asleep and paralyzed on the ventilator, whether they have COVID or not, are in such critical short supply that we're actually having to come up with backup plans just to get that stuff done. That's hours and hours of work. It's been phenomenal collaboration. And for the record, I mean, I really need to reiterate what an astounding job the governor, our state leadership and the CDPHE have done around this. It has been stoic. I can't say that all the results are what we hoped for, but without question, there has been a huge effort exerted on our patients' behalf and our community's behalf. And then the final part, before I fall apart at, I don't know, 9 o'clock at night, is the most exciting part of my job, which is the discovery and innovation work that I do as a professor of medicine, really focusing on how to advance the field and science of respiratory failure management, sepsis management in COVID-19. And so for many years, I've worked in the area of respiratory failure and sepsis, which is this overwhelming inflammatory response to an infection. And in the most, I think, bizarre way, I've become a growth stock. I never thought that my discipline would ever get any attention from the National Institutes of Health or industry. I mean, literally, we have been a backwater of research for years. And we talk about going from 0 to 60 in no time. We've got 6 clinical trials up and running. I have collaborations with people that I've not worked with previously. The level of interest in trying to really pick apart the molecular inflammatory cascades that underpin the COVID-19 response couldn't be more robust. And so I have a very busy research program, both internally and with collaborators at the University of Colorado National Jewish, working on these problems. And that's the counterbalance. That's the part that I think has made the slog of it, the moral dissonance of it, if not more manageable, then more focused. My days usually end by coming home, and that's not the end of work. So I usually then have about 3 hours of notes to write because unfortunately Medicare and Medicaid don't go away. And so, yeah, these are 17 and 80-hour days, and that's fine. I signed up for this. I didn't quite think what I signed up for would be COVID. But the parts I haven't really touched on in the final introductory comments are about the people that I'm working with in this endeavor. You know, I've been at Denver Health 19 years at the University of Colorado as faculty during that time, and originally from South Africa, spent time in London, Chicago, and New York. I thought when I was the ICU director at Columbia on 9/11, that probably was the most singularly challenging professional, emotional experience I would ever have in my career. And I'm not saying that you want to outcompete 9/11. It was an absolutely shattering experience that I think, in retrospect, I must have had some PTSD for a few years. But this is challenging in so many similar but also magnified kind of ways. And I think the indefiniteness of this experience, the scale of the tragedy, the death, the way that it's touched families that we all know in our own community here in Denver has been without measure. The context of that is I spend a lot of time fielding calls from communities on the East Coast. Particularly over the last 25 years, have worked with the Haredi communities of Brooklyn and New York around Muncie. And it all started when I was back in Columbia and looked after many patients from the ultra-Orthodox community. And for right or wrong, I've developed very close friendships and relationships in that community, such that there's a boundary problem a little bit. You know, I field a lot of calls from people that have sick families. And I think in a very personal way, the magnitude of this illness, particularly for the Jewish community, has really touched me in a way that extends beyond my Denver Health community and the population of Denver. To see the impact that COVID-19 has had on the Jewish community in its extent, in its full extent in New York, but particularly in New York, New Jersey, on the ultra-Orthodox community, is without description. And that's extended to the communities of Israel and the communities of Palestine. And I think that the challenges that we have, both you know, in our local regional community, but also at a larger scale, what does this mean? I think for us as a broader Jewishly identified Kehillah, is something that we're going to have to struggle with. The people I work with are phenomenal leaders, and I want to just comment on one thing in closing these initial comments, and that's to give credit to my very good friend Ryan Kramer. Many of you know Ryan is a just warm soul community general practitioner who has lived here for many years. Ryan has been my kids' surrogate grandpa from an early age. My parents live in South Africa, and my parents-in-law. So Ryan, who is a real expert in all things Kabbalah, spends a lot of time during the Omer thinking a little bit about how we can celebrate various of the midot, the values that signify each of the days. And we're just about to start counting the 42nd day of the Omer. And there's an algorithm that's used that I think is a very nice little touch point, because each day has a different kind of emphasis on different values that I think, for me as a physician, trying to imbue the caring process, which can be very technical, with a sense of purpose and moral integrity can be a huge challenge. And I struggle a lot with that. So today, the 42nd, or just coming up to the 42nd day, we're going to read about Malchut of Yesod. And what is Malchut? That's kingship or leadership. And the counterbalance of that today is Yesod, which is bonding or connecting. With the notion that, it's one thing to be a leader, but a leader who fails to make deep connections through listening, to enhance people's and nurture people's own strengths, doesn't function very well as a leader, and often may be ineffective. And I think one of the most humbling experiences that I've had through this initial experience of, even though I've been an IC director for many, many years, has been just how important it is to make connections in order to lead, and to really value the contributions of people from our very frontline environmental services people. I have just some of the most incredibly brave people going into rooms of people with COVID-19, cleaning out the rooms, sterilizing the rooms, bringing food, pharmacists in and out with drugs, to people procuring PPE for us. And the whole notion that connecting with those people one-on-one is what brings the group together, so you can hopefully lead them through what is a terrifying experience, I think is a very humbling message from today. And maybe I could leave that idea with you and take some questions.
Thanks so much. I know many of us will no doubt have questions. You can put your questions in the chat. And if that's not going to work for us, we'll just have people raise their hands. But use the chat. I think it would be the most helpful. I had a couple of questions for you, Dr. Douglas, before we get to the chat. Are the hospitals accommodating this COVID-19? Are they overwhelmed, or are they able to take care of the people that present themselves?
I'm going to speak first locally, and then I'll talk nationally about where we are and what we've seen, and try to illustrate this with a little bit of data. The Front Range hospitals, other than Longmont and all the way up to the border of our state, have always been within capacity to manage the volume and severity of illness of our patients, always. And where's the thing to celebrate? It's not necessarily just frontline workers. I think our community, our broader community, has a tremendous amount to celebrate and be proud about when it comes to the collective consciousness and responsibility of what was the stay-at-home order. So what I mean by that, this notion of flattening the curve is not about never getting COVID. Because the truth of it is, unless we get a vaccine or a knockout preventative medication, don't hold your breath, most of us are going to get COVID. Flattening the curve is really about preventing us going over the top of the capacity and resources that we have at a time when we really aren't scaled up to do that work. And the reason that our front range hospitals have been so incredibly capable and able to do this was because people played along the game for the first part. No question about it. Now, we can talk in a minute about what I'm worried about, which is phase 2, but that's the bottom line for our front range. I will tell you that Longmont and North, much because of meatpacking facilities, the prison, and various other sort of outbreaks in big local centers, got overwhelmed. They got crushed. They ran out of beds, they ran out of ventilators. The university system had to rapidly mobilize resources to get up there. And yet they still managed to get by with some mobilization. You all know the reality of what's happened on the East Coast. And you certainly are aware of the impending disaster in places like Brazil, my colleagues in Lombardy in northern Italy and what they confronted. And the recognition that we are so far from done in this thing, and that there are locales that will look just like Manhattan all over again. colleagues of mine from National Jewish were actually volunteering out at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, and so we debriefed a bit with them. And the upscaling of resources that they tried to achieve was heroic, but even then not sufficient at some of the world's most outstanding institutions. You know, they were converting operating rooms into 4-patient ICU rooms, converting hallways into temporary intermittent stabilizing areas. No PPE, no tests, no medications. And I'm not being dramatic, and that was on the Fifth Avenue hospitals. You go out to Brooklyn, and you go out, for example, Montefiore Medical Center in the Bronx, and the level of overwhelm was just beyond magical. I think that the stories that are going to be told about this will be grim in the extreme. I think for that reason, as we contextualize what's happening in Colorado, we really have to understand both how fortunate we have been, but similarly how ill-prepared we would be if there isn't a serious attention to reducing the likelihood of a second wave of disease.
Can you tell us a little bit about that second wave? What are you expecting?
I'm gonna prompt my cousin Ruthie here if she's on the line, because she is a real expert at this, and she's just written some really super pieces on this. So let me make some general comments, and then if you'll indulge me, we're partners in crime. Ruthie and I have been not just cousins, but close friends from birth. So, you know, here's the deal. There isn't any reason to doubt that with the opening up of states in the current environment, where we have failed to fundamentally control the emanation of the next of transmission, you'll hear a lot referred to as the R0 number, which is essentially the transmissibility of the infection, as well as provide some method to test extensively, not just for the infection itself, but for resistance or immunity to the infection. There's no doubt at all, and I don't think that any serious-minded person doubts that there's going to be a series of ripples now, some of which could be highly magnified. In the most credible model that we've seen, and some of it is based off less virulent infections, the third wave, which will be our fall boom, will be the biggest problem. And the reason that is so has a lot to do with, you know, darker days, cooler times, and a large number of people who are doing no social distancing at all, who are non-immune. And I don't think there's a reason to believe that we won't see a huge further boom of this disease in the early fall through to the winter. Ruth Etzioni, who's professor of biostatistics at University of Washington, Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center, do you want to make a comment? I think you're on mute. You're on mute, Ruth.
Okay, I unmuted. Hi, everybody. I'm first of all, Ivor, I'm just so proud of you. You're just such a hero to me. I'm going to choke up. I also want you to know that your uncle was watching.
Yeah, so.
Introduction. I was visiting him, my dad, our fathers are brothers. I think that you don't need to be a scientist to understand that this is not like a natural disaster, like a hurricane that comes and then it's over. It's everywhere. It started with very few people that came and seeded the epidemic in the United States. And today, the state in every state is hundreds practically, in practically every state, of cases every day. So we are already at a point where we're much more than when things started. And we saw what happened when things started as so small, and look how big they got. So there's no reason to think that it's washed over and it's over. And the problem is that messaging is coming out that's, you know, people want to believe that. And then messaging comes out and then they get to hear what they want to believe. But I'm sorry to say, it is not a hurricane And it's something that doesn't just go away. And so if you look at the past dynamics of what happened, the only way that it won't happen the same way in the future is if we don't make the same mistakes that we did in the beginning. We have to have learned, and we have to modify dramatically to be able to live with this so it doesn't get out of control again. And that's why there are going to be waves, and we have to try to think about how we're going to individually and as a community, put the lid on the waves until we can get immunity from a vaccine. And so the question is, how do we do that? And it needs to be done at the leadership level, at the state level, at the administration level, and then it also can be done at the individual level. And we can talk about specifics about that. I saw one of the questions, at the risk of, I don't want to take the limelight from my incredible cousin. Questions was, when will we be safe going to restaurants? I want to tell you, I'm not going to a restaurant for a long time. Probably won't go to a restaurant until next year. Until there's a vaccine, I'm not going to sit in a restaurant because it's not washing over and going away. We have to accept that reality. And that's why I agree so much with what Ivor just said.
Thank you. We do have a couple of questions in the chat.
Should I take a couple of those?
Do you see those?
I do. Should I take those?
Sure.
So there are several questions here about the opening. And I think if I could summarize, what I'll do is make some general comments, and then I'm going to be specific about social interaction, camp. Believe me, I have a son that was supposed to be a college camp counselor, Jewish Day camp this summer, and dorms. I have 2 kids going off to college, so I think those will be relevant. And then I'll make some general comments. The intense pressure, economic pressure to open is indisputable. The pain that we see from our families is that they're balancing this illness burden with 36 or 40 million people in this country newly unemployed, and many underemployed, with the real measurable sense that for large majorities of those people, their jobs will never come back. And so very reasonably, and you've heard our own governor speak with tremendous passion and care around how do you get this balance right. Now, let me reiterate, the point of shutting down the economy, social distancing, while personally reassuring, truly from a public health epidemiologic perspective, has so much more to do about stopping our hospitals getting overwhelmed than necessarily avoiding everybody getting sick. But the benefit, of course, is that if you don't get sick and you hang out till you get a vaccine, well, okay, so there's double benefit in that. But the truth of the matter is that the economy is going to open whether we like it or not. And we've seen this at a political level. We've seen it down Boulder Canyon. You probably saw the pictures from all the kids out on Boulder Canyon without masks last week. I have my own 18 and 20-year-old who are desperate to get out and saying, Dad, and Joel actually asked me, could you talk a little bit tonight about how on earth it's possible to be a person while still being safe? And I want to talk about that. You've heard Ruth speak as an epidemiologist and from our own personal perspective that when it comes to personal risk, if you're 50 and you have one single comorbidity, I cannot pretend to you that you aren't at increased risk. And if your body mass index is 30 or higher, and this is data just recently published, you have a 20 or 22% higher probability of getting the infection than if you have a low body mass. So just simple things. You add diabetes and hypertension, now we're exploding the risk. So very reasonably, I think that this is going to need to be staged. My parents very wisely have decided to stay indoors and to get things delivered, and they're not going out. And as recently as today, I had a discussion with my mum. She's on the line. She'll tell you it's true. I said, under no circumstances can you afford to do this. My 18-year-old is going to make some tough decisions. I am very worried about him personally contracting the illness and getting sick. But I'll tell you something. My bigger concern is less my son. as his own personal ill health than him being in contact with somebody's older relatives and transmitting it to them, or somebody's immunosuppressed relative, or somebody's developmentally delayed relative. And I think that it ultimately is going to have to come down to collective responsibility, which as a Jewish tradition, as a Jewish idea, is a very important one. I mean, this is a Rabbi Akiva idea, and I certainly wouldn't want to cite anything that our honored Ravs can't please give more context to, but it is really what the collective accountability, the social fabric notion is. And I think if any of us have some sense of accountability about that second wave and what to do about it and opening up, is the notion is that while it's probably okay to ease up some, we cannot afford blanket easing up in our economy. It will be a catastrophe. So going to the restaurant, my goodness, unless you have some compelling reason to do it, it's not a supportable action. Cook at home, make a nice kosher meal, my Rav will be happy with you. But seriously, I think that the notion that these expediencies are worthwhile cannot, from a purely biostatistical public health epidemiological basis, be justified. Take a walk in nature, absolutely. Wear a mask, please, be socially distanced. What about communal activities? So one of the big debates right now on the East Coast is opening up shuls, and it's going to become discussion that I'm sure our honored Ravs here are going to have to deal with, and our shul leadership is going to have to deal with. So what do? Do you have a minyan? That's very interesting. It's 10 people. Turns out that that actually is probably the maximum number of people that should be in a fairly confined space, socially distanced with a mask. So you could argue that if you can stick to the rules, maybe that's okay. But we know very well that a large Shabbos morning minyan is not going to work. A bar mitzvah is not going to work. And certainly, my symphony tickets have all gone back as donations. You're not going to the symphony anytime soon. And sadly, Red Rocks is not going to happen this summer. And summer camp, as you're probably hearing, has become an incredibly contentious, difficult thing. Again, not because of the teenagers necessarily, although there is some concern, but because of the constraints that it takes for adults to supervise who are at risk. I've been spending some time with one of our community members that's involved in organizing the Democratic National Committee, the convention in Milwaukee. And one of the biggest challenges that they're having is, is any of the DNC going to be held in person? Is any of it going to be able to be in a large room with delegates from around the country? And you can imagine the stakes could not be higher. And obviously what we've been counseling is exactly consistent with what I've said, is that the risks really remain way too high presently to deal with that. And I'm not kidding. This is not a halfway kind of thing. And then the last thing I think as far as opening up in our community is going to be commerce. Now we've seen some of that already, but a common question I get is, can I go to my beautician? I had my daughter did a COVID cut for me, so you can see she did a very good job. But should I go to the hairdresser? And to be honest with you, the answer can't be yes, because if you're a rational human being and you look at trading risk and benefit, your risk of transmission in that environment with somebody close in your face who may potentially be infected, but for whom we can't screen reliably on a regular basis, is too high. Now, you could argue me that the risk is higher driving to the beautician to get killed in a car accident, God forbid, than getting the COVID. And of course, there's some reason to do that trade-off on an individual basis. But I think the responsible answer is that if you can get away without doing that stuff, that is the rational approach to how to deal with these issues. The next question was about what do we do to protect our own families? And this has been a point of huge debate and much agony for providers. And I mean all frontline providers. These are fire people and service providers in grocery stores and people on delivery front lines. So let me tell you what I do and give you a sense of the range of things, because the measurable risk is very high. And there have been numerous cases of what is being described as hospital-acquired, home-transmitted infections, almost too many to describe, so suggest that this is a real phenomenon. The real problem with this virus, and to be honest with you, many viruses, is a silent incubation period. And you've heard all about that, but let's put that in context. From the time of contracting sufficient virus into your respiratory system and developing early symptoms is 8 to 10 days earlier, sometimes 12 to 14. In that period during the incubation, the number of virions, the RNA virus, that are present in the upper respiratory tract and that are expelled with just simply the process of speaking, not even coughing or sneezing, is sufficient if you're in close proximity to transmit the virus. That's a problem, and particularly with this virus, which is virulent in the extreme. And so it's that exposure risk that poses a risk to families of frontline workers. So what's my practice? I get home, I do the, let's call it the disrobe, much to my children's absolute horror. I take a downstairs shower, I put on clean clothes, I socially distance. I have not been sleeping in a separate room, but a colleague of mine absolutely will not sleep in the same room. And two of my colleagues, we've been able to secure hotel rooms for them because when they're on service in the week after, they're staying at the hotel and they are being, away from their families. I think that, you've got to make some trade-off there. That's not something I've been prepared to do. Nevertheless, this is a major problem and it's not going to go away. This is the big challenge of this persistence of the thing. So the next question you asked about is virus survival on surfaces and the risk of contagion. So this is linked to another very common question, which is what happens after I've had the illness and I'm recovering and my test is still positive, am I still infectious? So those are two very linked things. So without question, you cannot get sick from one viral particle. It's really important to understand that if you look at the epidemiology of this disease and the infectivity of the disease, there is a certain minimal bolus that has to be transmitted. So correctly, the majority of the outbreaks that we're seeing are in close domestic environments, close working environments, and then unfortunately is in care environments, prisons, and other closed environments. And in those environments, there are long sustained exposures to high levels of virus, and that's where we see the most intense infections. So really, this is about reducing harm to the most risky environments, but being appreciative that, there is some minimal exposure. So what's a minimal exposure? If you get on the airplane, some people now are contemplating, and the surface that you touch in front of you has just that certain minimal 800 virions on it, and you happen just to touch your face, as many of us do many hundred times a day, it's very likely you're going to get the virus. It's a very infective virus. If you order in from the store or your mail is delivered, the question then is the virus on those packages still infectious? The answer is that after 4 to 12 hours on things like paper, some material, the virus is present but has degraded enough that it's non-infectious. But on some metal surfaces, it's persistent. Very concerning, new data has shown that in still air, so that's not rapidly moving air, a closed room, simply speaking, it generates a cloud of particles that if you're in close proximity is infectious. And a cough is in a closed environment is highly infectious. One cough, once the particles are suspended, they remain in suspension in the atmosphere for periods of hours. Whether that's sufficient to infect or not is still to be determined. So let's not kid around about this stuff. This is as classically infectious disease that we're going to see in our lifetimes. And anybody that thinks that it's cool to just, go up and play, I think the challenge is that, the expectation is some other healthcare system is going to be there to back them up. And yeah, of course we're going to be there, but we just aren't a limitless supply. How do I balance physical health and mental health? The challenge of being out of work, being to drug addiction, child and spousal abuse. My goodness. So this is from Nancy. Nancy, I think that we are seeing the beginnings of a tremendous public health psychiatry disaster. And I'll break it down because some of the stuff is in the common press and some is, I think, more common, and I'll talk about me. I think my biggest concern is for families where there may be domestic violence risk or child violence or elder violence risk as being my biggest concern. And we're certainly aware of a few cases. I think there's a huge hidden epidemic of domestic violence, and that's both physical and sexual violence. And I fear tremendously that the inadvertent consequence of constraining being able to get out of the home, get to a work or school environment is going to have huge long-term consequences. And really, when we think about opening the economy, let's be clear, there are benefits that are non-tangibles. These are one of the non-tangibles. I think that there are going to be PTSD and anxiety and depression consequences of this that are going to be the responsibility of our rabbinate and our counselors to deal with for many, many years to come. I see my Rav Elliot Baskin giving a good nod there. I cannot tell you the magnitude of that because I don't think we know, but I'll be clear that there's two groups of people. There are people that survive the illness directly, and then there are people who have been secondarily affected. What I mean by that, family and friends of those who've died, family and friends of healthcare workers who've had all this happen, and then most tragically, the people whose lives have been destroyed either socioeconomically or through racial targeting for our Asian American population. And I think that we have to really understand the magnitude at a public health level of the psychological impact of this well beyond the virus. I think in many respects, what the virus has exposed is how paper thin, or the veneer of social integrity that we have internationally, but sadly domestically, and how vulnerable our social contract is to the exploitation by folks who are politically willing to manipulate the difficult situation, people that are scamming people around drugs and other therapies who are desperate, financial ripoffs, things that are going to destitute older people who are vulnerable and not as sophisticated to some of the phishing attacks that are going on. You know exactly what I'm talking about, but this is now amplified. So that's the big level. So at a micro level, I think that being very intentional in the work that we do every day, whether it's in our daily activities, whether it's in the fact that we are at home, is a very important habit. What I mean by that, and I defer here to my rabbinic leadership about how to make our Jewish identity part of this, but I've long believed that the work we do is about creating meaning in our lives and the lives of other people. I have the absolute privilege in this pandemic to be creating value and meaning in a way that is, you said it frontline, people sort of magnify that. It's not very glorious, but there's an easy way for me to be helpful and impactful and create meaning in people's lives. But the fact is that we all have agency in that regard. And I think intentionality in that is a powerful antidote to the inevitable fact of depression, anxiety, and withdrawal that is so prevalent and can be so magnified. So I had my first Zoom meeting this morning at 7 o'clock. Many of you did the same. I've been Zooming a lot of today because I'm on a non-clinical day. And it's lovely to see you all, but I'm missing the personal contact, right? Peter Gottlieb and I used to we always have a little schnapps, Erev Shabbos. I keep saying, Peter, when are we going to have a schnapps, right? So there are those things that I think are irreplaceable. And so it's so important that we don't lose the potential for personal contact to reinforce the work that we're doing as a society together. I can tell you the impact on healthcare workers is very, very grave. Denver Health particularly, and not to magnify some stuff that's been in the media recently, but has been hit by a crisis of confidence during the COVID pandemic related to some leadership failures and challenges. And that, in many respects, has just upended so much of the resilience that our workers bring to the front line that just wasn't needed at any time. And I think that even the strongest amongst us who bring, I think, real courage and grit to the work we do have had the core value set that we bring around resilience and leadership challenged to its very most profound level. I don't think there's a good answer to that. And I think that it's, as I say, many of us are going to have to do some serious work as we continue through this process. Not because I think we can prevent the psychological fallout of this, but I think we all know that there's another side to this. There is an end to this, so we've got to transcend and move through. I don't know, Rabbi, do you want me to take another question, or what's your preference?
About one more, and then we'll let you get some rest.
Very good. Well, I'm more than happy to keep talking, as apparently you can now appreciate. I really like this question from Mort about the degree of severity, the predictions, and the ethics of using wide administration simple drugs which have not been around for many years and seem in many places to be effective as prophylaxis, even if not subject to large-scale, double-blind, randomized control trial. Fantastic. What a topical and important question. Surely it makes sense that if there's therapies available that seem to be beneficial, even if they have not been rigorously prospectively tested, surely out of an abundance of just rachmanis and compassion, if you could potentially save a life, shouldn't you do that? Isn't there an imperative? And it may be nice, I don't know if Rabbi Grunwald, Rabbi Dolan, Rabbi Baskin want to comment on this. The pikuach nefesh idea is a very central one to the way that from a prerogative that we bring to care and cure, that we think about the responsibility. And I balance this every day because, yeah, I've got to tell you, I've got some cool stuff that I really want to try out. Really cool stuff. There's a therapy that a colleague and I really want to try, and we did try it because we had a patient who was dying. And now we have a clinical trial up to actually test whether a clot-busting medicine to break up clots in the lung could actually save lives. But the first time I did it, I got to tell you, I had a sleepless night. And I had a staggered 3-hour meetings with people trying to work out if it was ethical to give this medicine, which has real side effects, including bleeding in your brain, in the interest that we might save this patient's life to enhance their breathing. And I'll be honest with you, at the bottom of the day, as tempting as it seems to give people hydroxychloroquine, there isn't a justifiable reason to do that. And it hasn't got to do with benefit. It's not the pikuach nefesh argument. It has everything to do with the Hippocratic mandate to first do no harm. And I think it's that tension, the balance that we bring in the ICU to the bedside in every decision we make. And I don't want to be dramatic, but an average intensivist looking after 20 patients is making 350 unique to 400 unique decisions every day. Some small, some of huge magnitude. And every one of those decisions is a trade-off. It's a probabilistically reasoned trade-off. And to be honest with you, when you're making decisions where therapies are involved that are not just potentially beneficial, but potentially seriously harmful, there is no place for that trade-off in our practice. And so I understand the temptation to support that, but I would say there's an even bigger mandate to rapidly escalate the opportunity to test new therapies in clinical trial.
Okay, thank you all, and Ivor, incredible presentation. So very helpful to us that are, as you know, sitting in our homes and wondering what the next step will be. We know in Judaism that saving even a single life is as if you save the entire world. And you are saving worlds in what you do at Denver Health and for keeping us safe and taking care of us. So I want to thank you for giving us your time. I want to thank everybody for coming on and listening to Dr. Douglas and just being a part of the HEA community. And let me just say, Laila Tov and Toda Rabah.
And thank you to all of you and for the opportunity. Be well, everybody.